Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for watching. I'm Roger Horne. I'm excited about our guest today, David Becker. He's a European-American mixture. His family comes from the Netherlands and Germany. He himself was born and raised in the USA. Thank God he speaks fluent German. And he's a relatively well-known musician. Relative, of course, is hugely understated. He was nominated for a Grammy. That's a pretty big honor. But we haven't invited him here as a musician, instead as someone who's engaged himself with his family history, which is a bit tragic and actually has gone virtually unknown in Europe, although it has a German-Dutch background. What got you started in this?
I've followed this story my entire life, but when I was around 19 or 20, I became consciously aware. You know, when you're 9 or 10 years old and you think my mother was in a prison camp, then you think Hogan's Heroes. You know that show. So when I was 18 or 19, I visited Germany and the Netherlands quite often, and my mother's best friend Edith, who was also in prison camp, same story as my mom, she German mother and Dutch father. My grandmother even knew her mother in Wiesbaden. I asked her once, I said, tell me about Indonesia and how it was. My mother had told me a few stories, and Edith had too, and then I began to put them together out of curiosity. I basically heard these stories my entire life, also from my uncle, and I began taking notes. Somehow I knew that sometime in my life I would address this topic with my music. I often thought while I was flying, for instance, to Argentina, how was it for my grandfather, who had to travel 3 months by train through Siberia on his very first trip to Indonesia, or my grandmother, at the age of 16, 3 to 4 weeks by ship. That must have been really hard. I can't complain about 24 hours in an airplane. That's nothing compared to what they had to go through. And then it just continued from there. So, about 2 years ago, a TV production company from Cologne approached me about my family story because my grandmother was born in Cologne. They asked me if I could write everything down and we'll do something with it. So I sat together with them and told them all the stories that I had put together, and we wrote everything down chronologically for the first time. It really gave me lots of ideas, and unfortunately, the documentary never came to fruition because they didn't have the money, which was okay anyway, but I began to write music, and it just started flowing out.
So you're telling the story on our program instead?
Exactly. The story more or less is that my grandmother went from Cologne to Wiesbaden, met my grandfather, who was 15 years older, and married him at the age of 16 and went to Indonesia. My grandfather came back to Europe in the early 1930s, and my grandmother remarried a friend of my grandfather's. They had studied together at the university in Wageningen. Her new husband was then appointed Minister of Agriculture. In December of 1941, the Japanese invaded Indonesia, and a little bit later, they put all the Dutch in prisoner of war camps for the next 4 years.
Prisoner of war camps is a nice way to say it. I've looked in several history books, and there it says concentration camps.
Yeah, they were concentration camps. I mean, they were basically labor camps. My mother had to do really hard physical labor at the age of 12 or 13. They made them do really horrible things, such as building barbed wire fences. They had to dig ditches. They had to throw water in the faces of the elderly whenever they would flip out. They had to build coffins. They did all these different things. It was really terrible, really terrible.
What was the justification from the Japanese to put the people in labor camps? Especially your grandmother, who was German, although she was married to a Dutchman.
That I really can't say exactly, but I guess the Japanese were overwhelmed with the Dutch. I mean, basically they had no real defense. Their arms were from the war with Portugal in the 1800s, so there wasn't really a fight. I mean, in the beginning, the Japanese put only the men in prison, and the women and children were allowed to stay in their houses, and they instituted house arrest thereafter, and then they brought them into camps too. And I believe they wanted to work the Dutch to death, so they would be so tired that they wouldn't be able to show any resistance to the Japanese. The first thing they did is they took all their cameras, all their writing materials away, They had virtually nothing. I mean, it's quite ironic because when Edith's mother went back to Holland, she was not welcomed by the countrymen. I mean, she said that she spoke to her sister-in-law, and her sister-in-law said, "What do you want from us? We had war too." And one day she picked up a teaspoon and she said, "At least you had teaspoons with your tea." They had nothing. They had no real clothing, no shoes. They had to work every day from morning till night. They were dead tired. My mother's 80 now, and she has back problems from all this. She never got restitution from Japan, no apologies, nothing.
Your mother is still living? She's in Germany?
She lives in California, where I live when I'm in the USA.
At least the climate there is good for her bones.
Yeah, that it is. I mean, actually, my mother never felt that the Netherlands was her home. She always had said that Indonesia was her home. Since this project was released, I've received many emails from Indonesians who told me that they loved the Dutch and they'd love to have them back. They had a good experience. It wasn't a slave colony or anything like that. They treated them with respect. My mother's stepfather was in the government, and we have a photo of him in front of one of the federal buildings in his white suit, and there are just as many Indonesians as Dutchmen in that photo. They too had high positions.
You talk a lot about this project, which is a CD called Batavia, which basically retells the story musically, but also included as a booklet with liner notes about each piece and its background. But I wanted to get back to the point when the war ended. Japan lost. Japan was on the side of the Germans. What did the Japanese do as compensation or as an apology?
Nothing. Nothing, absolutely nothing. What's really interesting is that the United States forced the Dutch, Prince Bernhard, to sign a treaty that they wouldn't seek restitution from Japan, and in exchange, they would get the Marshall Plan. Now, we all know how important the Marshall Plan was, but on the other hand, that was an insult to the Dutch who were interned. I mean, all the Dutch Indonesians had done so much for the Dutch Commonwealth and the Dutch economy with the spices and everything, and to just say, "We don't care about you," or whatever, I mean, they were just simply cast aside. And that's not right. You know, finally this year, after 65 years, for the very first time, the Prime Minister of Japan said that they did do terrible things in World War II, but they never mentioned the Dutch. So, it's our intention to draw attention through this project so people will say, we need to build a memorial for these people.